You're not gonna believe it.
What?
I got another one.
Seriously? Another podcast?
Yep. And this one looks like they think they're hot shit.
Have they all?
Pretty much.
What sets this guy apart?
Oh no. Are any of them any different these days?
Well, there's one other listen.
Are you serious? You're gonna listen to this guy?
Why not? We listen to the others, don't we?
If so, oh well. Who's hoping it's a good one at least?
Cheer it up. Could be worse. It could be woke.
Lord help me.
Warning. You are about to start the Spirit and Flame podcast. Some of what you are about to hear may be offensive to some audiences. Entertainment is the name of the game and nothing is meant to be taken seriously. This show is meant for adults only. You've been warned. Now, without further ado, the fiery host for this show, the one and only Red.
Hello. Hey, everybody. I would like to welcome you to the first episode of the Spirit and Flame podcast, and I am your host, Red. And you may be wondering, what is the Spirit and Flame podcast? Well, it's just another podcast. Nothing too special about it. On this podcast, we're going to have a few different sub-variants, if you will. We're going to have segments that focus a bit on pop culture, a little bit of nostalgia, a lot of what I consider sort of retro or vintage from when I was growing up and a kid, as well as a little bit before that. And we're going to look at things sort of comprising from the 80s and onwards. And occasionally we'll look at the odd topic here and there that sort of maybe falls before that, where it's relevant. We're also going to look at video games, movies, and that sort of thing in that kind of vein, and we'll kind of split them up to keep them somewhat relevant. So video gaming related stuff, board game related stuff, anything card game or trading cards, that's all going to be kind of kept together, and we're going to be calling that segment what we have here, which is known as the Red Mage segments. So just keep your eye open for this sort of setup here with the blue and purple kind of theme on the thumbnails, and that will kind of keep you able to kind of recognize those topics. Obviously, the titles will try their best to be informative as well, but sometimes you have to game the system. So just keep your eye open on those blue thumbnails for anything gaming, trading card, or retro kind of pop culture related that is not related to movies. For movies, we're going to split those out because I feel that there's a little bit of a different nuance when discussing those, and they definitely come with their own flavor of things. So I've decided to kind of split them out in my discussions as well, and what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be referring to those with this sort of black and white theme. Part of that is to just sort of contrast if I'm going to put, say, a picture or an image of that movie, it's going to be pretty easy to spot what kind of movie it is, what the movie I'm talking about, or anything like that. And the black and white won't really detract from the colors if there's variations and stuff. So that's part of the thinking there. But yeah, just keep your eye open for the black and white if you're more interested in movies. And for books, comic books, graphic novels, regular novels, anything book related, including, say, some old books or classics, or even nonfiction as well. I'm going to kind of try and keep those all related to this sort of goldish yellow theme. under the banner of the Red Page. And the idea there is to sort of focus a little bit more on book-related content. And again, because not everybody has the same interest in things, this will sort of separate it and make it easy for people to spot through the thumbnails. Of course, for people that are interested in all this content, it won't really matter to them, but they'll kind of know what they're getting with each video. For more, let's call it general purpose life stuff, life hacks, life tips, just general commentaries maybe, or philosophy, or opinions, or things that involve just life in general, nothing too specific, things that you can just apply to your everyday and your daily goings and comings. I'm going to have a sort of this green segment called the Red Sage. And not that the advice is going to necessarily be sagely, although I will do my best to pass on advice that I consider to be sagely. But more so, it's just because that's kind of how I feel about this segment. Is the focus is to be somewhat productive and offer my opinions, my perspectives that I feel could benefit people. This is not going to be a segment for ranting. In fact, I have a separate segment for rants, which is going to be done in red because obviously it's fitting. And that will be called the Red Rage segments. And yeah, it's where I will be potentially ranting and raving and cursing and all that fun stuff. So if you're interested in the more cathartic videos, if you like to hear people rant and perhaps you even share the same opinions and you also just feel the same way as I do about some of these topics, then by all means follow along. If you feel the opposite to me, this might be not the segment for you. You might want to avoid these red segments because they may offend you or you might get angry with me. And I don't really want to start any wars over the videos. It's more so just for me to rant about whatever the topic is. And so I'm trying to make that kind of clear again by segmenting out this segment with its own little thumbnails and whatnot. And then for things that are more general purpose, kind of, I'm not really sure where to put them. They're kind of rants, maybe in part. They're kind of advice, maybe in part. They might just be discussions or random thoughts I had. Maybe it was a shower thought from that day or something that's been gnawing at me. Or maybe it's something that I just wanted to discuss. It's also anytime that I'm going to be, say, giving anything more meta or discussing the channel itself. It'll be probably more under this sort of generic banner here that you see in front of you. No real branding. It's just the Spirit and Flame podcast. And that's kind of the the theme for probably anything that doesn't really have a strong topic. I'll just kind of lump it into here. And for now, this video is currently being streamed under the generic banner, but I'm sure I'll change that if the content is fitting of one of the others. Being that this is the first episode of the podcast, I am going to kind of, add some extra commentary here and there, so it's not really focused exactly as it's labeled, but I will try to get into it, which is Timezones. That's going to be the main topic of this initial episode, and I'm sure I will do another topic on time zones in the future. I'm sure of it, because time zones are one of those things that they just constantly come up and they bite you in the ass every time. You think you got it, you're wrong. I'm just going to tell you now. You think you understand time zones, you don't. I don't think anybody does, to be honest. I'm pretty sure it takes an entire team of people across multiple countries and various international organizations to figure this shit out. And I think even then, it's like half the time they're just waving their thumb in the air and guessing. I shit you not. When it comes to time zones, it's just madness. Layers and layers of madness. And it's got so bad that there's even as we'll get into, conspiracy theories involving time zones because of how awful the entire situation is. It should be easy, but it's not. And we're going to get into not necessarily the reasons why it's not, because who fucking knows why it's not as easy as it should be. That's why there are literal conspiracy theories forming, because of the madness that are time zones. And as a programmer, as somebody who has to deal with them on a pretty consistent basis, I find myself pulling what little hair out I have, or what little hair I have left out because of some of the madness, to be honest. I'm telling you, time zones are a bitch. They're one of the worst things that you will ever come across if you are forced to deal with them. And you'll laugh if you've never dealt with time zones at just the thought that time zones are something awful. But I'm telling you now, time zones are insane. They are awful at all levels if you try to rationalize and wrap your head around it. It's almost like a cone, if you will. It's something you have to just constantly mull over and meditate on, possibly for the remainder of your life, until seeking enlightenment. And perhaps if you ponder on this cone of time zones long enough, something will come to you, and you'll have an epiphany, and you'll break through, and you'll be enlightened up a level. I don't know. I keep thinking I've cracked the cone, and I'm wrong every time. There's always another aspect to it that I haven't meditated on, I haven't realized, and when I suddenly see it, I'm forced to go back and learn again from the basics, to revisit the assumptions I previously had and to tear them down. With time zones, it's just a constant up and down mountain ride. You're always pushing the boulder back up the hill, because that boulder is going to come tumbling down at some point, because the assumptions that you pushed it up with just aren't going to hold for forever. And sometimes it's infuriating. Sometimes it's super stressful, because if you have a time zone problem and you have a time crunch problem where, maybe it's a client or some weird artificial or actual deadline showing up and you need to get this stuff done before then it can be pretty stressful sometimes to crack out some of these weird inanities that you find in time zones. And what are these inanities, you may be wondering? Well, for those of you who have been blessed with an innocent life, allow me to destroy that, and let us talk about some of the craziness that comes up when dealing with time zones. First off, time zones typically are not context-free. You can't just look at time zones and describe all the relationships that you have to be aware of when discussing them. At best, you maybe can describe where they are on a geographic map, what their relative differences are, so to speak, and within some boundaries of dates, have some assurances on their relative accuracy down to, say, an hour or so, maybe a half hour for some time zones. And at other times, you can't trust any of those assumptions, because at any given time, things can weirdly shift. Because time zones are really political lines drawn on the sand, much like lines drawn on the maps. And as Sudan and lots of other countries can tell you, they change their borders and they become new countries, and sometimes they split, sometimes they acquire other countries. There's all sorts of things that happen with borders, and time zones are just another type of border. They're borders with time, but they don't follow what we would consider to be traditional kind of standards. You might think there's 24 time zones because there's 24 hours in a day, and you're not right. You're very wrong. There are time zones of different sizes. There are time zones of different offsets as well. So you'll find that within the same, say, geographic arrangement, you may have different time zones as you go up and down the latitudes, say, because part of it is related to, again, a lot of politics. And so you have all these sort of political implications that have to be taken into account when they're drafting these time zones. Some islands even don't have a consistent time zone and sometimes recognize multiple time zones because of the various trading partners that they work with that have their own recognized time zones. And in order to make certain accounting practices easier with certain businesses, for example, on one side of an island, they may never do business with another country due to just the geographic nature. And so the port there may have its own time zone specifically for just handling the ports. And on the other side of the island, they may also get transit, but they too may never take on shipments from the other side. And so they'll have a specific time zone that's designed specifically for the countries that they may be dealing with due to historical reasons or potential trade embargoes or all sorts of weird things that have come up over the years. And so not only do you sometimes have to take that into account if your clients are in those locations, but sometimes you have to take that into account because your clients' clients are in those locations, or their clients' clients and client. It's like it's all just trees down. And as you go farther and farther down, every branch could potentially cross into a new time zone, and you're never really sure if you need to accommodate it or not. Sometimes you don't until it comes up, and it's only going to come up as a bug usually. And so usually you're getting a lot of bug reports. That's usually the biggest experience with time zones is, why doesn't this thing work? And so you spend a lot of time doing row-by-row analysis, looking at data, and just trying to figure out what's wrong first off, because you don't even necessarily know that it's a time zone problem. There's a set number of steps you usually have to take to debug the problem in the first place, just to figure it out, because a lot of the time, if it's a time zone issue, funny enough, it may not be you might not be able to trigger it yourself. Sometimes you have to fake it just to get the issue to show up, or do weird tests in at weird times of the day to trigger it locally because of the nature of these bugs. They actually occur in time sometimes. So when you're dealing with time zones, you're actually dealing with like the physical time sometimes as well as the relative time. And the physical time actually requires you to sit there at a specific time in order to run your test, or you have to wait until a specific time has passed before your test can be tested. Otherwise, you have to fake it. And if you don't know what the issue is sometimes that you're trying to fake it, you sometimes just have to wait through trial and error to figure out what the issue is, because you can't trigger it yourself and you're not seeing it. And you're like, well, what time zone are they in? And you're waiting around, you're trying to figure out what time zone they're in, and then you're like, am I ahead? Am I off? Is it one of those weird time zones that are just, the half-hour mark for some reason? Is it one of those time zones that has like weird political weird shifts? Is it daylight savings time? What day of the month is it? What day of the year is it? I don't know, but I should check it because it's a time zone issue and I need to know this stuff. When was this issue actually reported? Was it reported like local time? Are we talking like the data in our system is wrong, or is it the data we're presenting? Is it bad data? Is the data misaligned? Are we miscalculating something? Have we just rendered the date wrong? In other words, is all the data exactly correct except for the date? Is that the issue? Or have we actually gone and bundled everything up and aggregated it on the wrong time? And so have we shifted our days around, and are we actually pulling the wrong records in to each day and saying that one day is another, but it's in a different time zone? And so the person's looking at it going, that's not right. I didn't make that many sales yesterday. Why did I make that? Why does it say I made all these sales yesterday? I didn't make any of these sales until this morning. But because of a time zone shift, it's thrown it to yesterday because of whatever. Or worse, did you accidentally convert it to Universal Standard Time and then forget that you did that, and which is usually a pretty good thing to do. But then did you reconvert it again, assuming that it wasn't in local? So are you doing a double conversion? Are you pushing it now to the opposite side of wherever it's supposed to be? Have you pushed it forward by a day accidentally? Is it in, and question, have you thought about the other side of the world? Because this is all relative to Greenwich Meridian time, and the dates are all relative to that specific universal date line. So then you're like, oh, okay, wait a second. Let me hold on. Let me go back. Let me make sure I got this. What date is this? What time is it? Where is this person that's reporting this? Oh, okay. And then when you're doing e-commerce, where are your customers located when they're buying your stuff? Have they shown up is their date that they purchased this in their time zone, or is it in your time zone? Do you bill by the store or the local? And it better be by the store, you hope. But then maybe your clients get a bit upset, or they're not really sure, because if you're expecting a payment on a particular day and you send the invoice with your local timestamp and you're sending it halfway around the world, maybe they're paying a day late. And then if you've got stipulations in your contract that if they pay late, there's an extra fee that maybe is automatically tacked on, and suddenly there's this auto fee that's tacked on, even though they paid perfectly on time, and in their mind, they were doing what they thought. These are all issues that come up all because of time zones. And we haven't even gotten to the conspiracies. These are just the actual problems that come up. And then there's also my favorite kind, when you're sampling data as well. You just go through and you're sampling, and you think that's simple. It's like, oh yeah, I'm just going to sample here, sample there, sample there, sample there. Okay, cool. I've sampled it. And you sampled it on a timestamp. Or so you think. Is your timestamp accurate? Is the timestamp data that you stamped it aware of its physical location? Is it actually correct? Do you have two pieces of equipment operating in different time zone boundaries? Is one piece of your equipment operating in a daylight savings time enabled area, while another one of them are operating in daylight savings time disabled area? And is your machine aware of that? And does it take into account? Does it normalize, or do you have to normalize the data yourself? Do you have to know wherever it is and what time it was? And do you have to do these weird calculations on the timestamp? And do you have to do these retroactive corrections? Because potentially, if you don't, and the time zone shifts, you might suddenly have multiple records of things happening simultaneously at once that are actually supposed to be an hour apart, but they seem to be overlapping. Or maybe you get the reverse. Maybe we're doing a fallback, and suddenly a spring forward, and a whole hour of your data is just missing. And you're like, what's going on? Is this normal? And it is, because technically an hour doesn't really exist there. There's just like an hour missing. And that is normal. But if you try to query for that hour, then you have to do it one of two ways. You either return nothing, because technically that hour doesn't exist, or you do a correction and you give them the actual hour, which is sprung forward by 1, but then on the chart it shows 1 hour ahead of what they think. So it's like they want to see what happened between midnight and say 3 in the morning, and you're showing this weird gap, and you're showing them, there's a gap from 1 to 2 o'clock, and you're like, what? Why is there this gap? Where's my data? Well, the data is not missing. They're just, that time doesn't exist. You got to realize that you got to figure out how to deal with that. So then you're like, okay, so what do we use? Well, it's like, then you would use Unix epoch time usually, which is also not really perfect, but it's like the ticks per second, or the ticks since. But that only works within certain date ranges, and if you want to go and look at anything historical, it's not going to really apply there. So you'd have to apply the concept in theory, but that would require that you accurately know all those changes in advance. So you pretty much have to do all the math in order to to generate it going backwards. Whereas going forward, it's managed by, again, one of these giant standards bodies that just keep track of this stuff. And so we can use the standard as a potential workaround. But what happens if we are running a snapshot in the background on a server somewhere, and we are running this for everybody? Do we keep track of days? And if so, like for example, if we're wondering daily totals, are we doing daily totals from server time? Or are we doing daily totals from local time? Because if we're doing daily totals from local time, we have to know the local time of the user when we're doing those totals. And so we either have to run them on the fly and do the translation at the time the query is being made, which is fine for certain data sets. But if we have huge, big data sets that need to be aggregated from multiple sources and essentially need to be flattened and cleaned up and whatnot, and they all come from different timestamps as well, all these things happened at different times. So we have to smear this data somehow, one way or another, and usually you smear it by date. But a date has a time zone. And a lot of people don't think about that. They just think of the date in their calendar, but it's on a continuous circle. It goes around every year. There's 1 year. And so your days are drawn on that circle. But as you move into different time zones, the day boundaries move with you. And so your idea of a day is different in different time zones. And so if you are doing this, you have to decide, are you doing this by server time? In which case it has to have a set server time zone. And if you're going to do it at that level and you're smearing it at the date level, you will never be able to do a clean transition across the date boundaries. You just won't be able to, because you've had to roll up and flatten data and smear it, and you've lost the actual time that these things happened. And worse, if some of these things are supposed to happen simultaneously, but just the nature of querying requires them to happen, say in series, or there's not a guarantee that everything happens simultaneously, then you still have to smear the data one way or another. And so you're losing some accuracy one way or another. And if that crosses a date boundary, you're going to lose data. It's not going to be accurate. And it's just the nature of the game. And so you have to work with the assumptions that you're limited by. And you have to be aware of them. And you can't just lie to yourself and say, well, I'm not going to worry about that. That assumption, I'm sure I can work around it. You can dream, and some of them you can work around, but it requires the work, which means that it's not going to be solved as simply. There are additional challenges and usually additional limitations. For example, you may not be able to go back in time, or it may be a change that cannot be reverted once made. It has to be made once, and it has to stay that way, because if it's changed, you can't necessarily go back in time and fix some of this data without corrupting it. So you just have to acknowledge that this change can't happen anymore, and you have to be content. Or if you allow the change, then you have to acknowledge that there may be some discrepancies in your data now because of these time zone differences that were interjected by a setting change. And worst case scenario, you didn't know you needed to set it, and you forgot about it, and then the issue showed up, and oh god, you can't go back in time anymore. You're stuck with this. So now you're working suddenly out of some time zone or halfway around the world to check your daily stats, and it just doesn't seem to line up with your business, because your business is, say, all local customers who work on the daily, and so your days, your values are all screwed up, and you're like, what is going on? And so you gotta line up. You might lose some history, but you need to get that data sorted out. Otherwise, the assumptions are going to kill you going forward. And that's just constant insanity with time zones. Not to mention that time zones are not necessarily respected by every system equally. not all systems support all time zones. So sometimes you have to do like these weird workarounds where you might support a time zone that they don't. And so you just have to pick another time zone. You have to translate it yourself. You just got to decide, well, I guess we're always going to be 30 minutes off with this particular data. And it's just these crazy little things that they stress you out because there's no way you can really solve them. You just got to accept it. You just got to suckle on the cone and accept it. Just meditate on it. Find enlightenment in the time zones. And then it continues. And you're like, okay, you finally got it sorted out. There's no issues. Everything's going well. Then out of the blue, suddenly someone's calling up and saying, well, there's a problem. You're like, well, there can't be time zones. Nobody else has had any problems. And you look and it's like, oh, wait a second. This client's in a new country. I've never had this country before. I got to learn about this country. Oh my God, this country has a bunch of different time zones. Oh no. They have half hours. Great, I gotta add half hours. Okay. Oh, but these integrations don't support half hours. So now they're confused why this data is, because apparently they do support half hours, just not on the API for some reason. I don't know. That's just because. So it's madness on all sides. And e-commerce as well. Oh, my sales totals don't add up. Is the time zone in the same spot? Do we have the same time zone? Are we looking at this in the same, like under the same context? Because if we're not, it's not going to add up. And there's no way that we can make it. We need these things to be the same. We need some stability here. And time zones provide so little stable ground that it's just nothing but just, I don't know, just shaking, earthquakes all the time. And then you've got the actual conspiracies. The real conspiracies are starting to come up now. Because people are just like, what is going on with these time zones? Why is this shit so bad? Why am I dealing with this crap? Why do we not have just 24, man? Or double it, 48. Some can go unused. I don't care. It can, as long as they're like consistent time zones, even if they're unused. But no. This company's not gonna recognize this particular variant of daylight savings time. It's gonna ignore daylight savings changes. It's gonna use whatever the time zone was at the time of the year that you signed up, and it's gonna freeze it in time, even though wherever the hell you are constantly changes. But maybe they got all these complaints and they can't go back and fix their stuff, so they correct it on their system for you, but they didn't put it in the API. And you're like, oh, okay, so I don't get any of these nice value adds? Okay, fine. But then the conspiracy theories come in and they say, no, it's even worse than that. It's not just politics like I mentioned earlier. It's not just, bad organizational skills. It's not just programmers that, screwed up at some point over the last 50 years in the standards department and didn't push hard enough. It wasn't committees out there. No. It's that the earth is flat. They even have time zone conspiracies in the flat earth community. Because that's how bad time zones are. That it's gone to the point where they're better explained by the flat earth model than they are explained by just regular politics. Because you're kind of looking at this and you're like, this is insane. There's time zones all over the fucking map. And then the flat earth group goes, it's not insane if you put it on a flat earth. And then you go, you're insane. How does that make any sense? How can these time zones make any goddamn sense on a flat earth if they don't make any sense at all on the globe and on our maps and like our political lines? And it's like, because just do it. And you're like, oh, just show me already. Just show me. What is it? Let me just see it. And then they start telling you, they're like, well, it's because the shape is all off and all the meridians and the geometry's all wrong. But the time zones, there's less time zones in the north and there's more time zones in the south. And in the middle, there's something like 24 time zones or something. And then you're like going, what? And And they go, yeah. And in the north, apparently they cut out some time zones. And there's only like 19 time zones as you travel around the globe. You just have these like, or maybe it could be 18. I don't know. But in the northern half, apparently there's just like 19 or 18 time zones. And then you get down into the middle around the equator and you start seeing 24 time zones. And if that, by the way, the people at the equator know what's fucking going on. They know what's what? 24 time zones. Is it so hard? Ecuador, you motherfucking beautiful bastards down there. Keep doing what you're doing with your time zones. Beautiful. 1 hour, that's all we need. Nice 1 hour time zones. Okay? And anyways, apparently, that's what they say, 24 time zones down in the middle area. And then as you like go down south, they just start erupting. Madness. There's like 24 time zones, and then there's got to be like 30 something. Some ridiculous number of time zones. 30 something. I don't know how many. I'm assuming like, let me see, 31 maybe? 31 maybe? I don't know. Some ridiculous number of time zones. Apparently down in the southern hemispheres. All those islands down there. And, so the conspiracy theory says that it's because the globe gets bigger. But the sun kind of travels around the equator, doing its thing. And so you get this weird effect where you just need more time zones in the bottom because it's covering so much ground. And then you need you need less time zones in the north because it's covering less ground. It's not quite making those giant maybe it's the other way around, sorry. Yeah, so it's the other way around. So in the north, it's making these giant leaps. Just shooting around, covering a lot of ground, and so they just shorten up the time zones to cover up for it. And then south, because it's covering so much land mass, so much extra, they added all these extra time zones in there with like half-hour marks or something. And the idea there, you have to remember, is one, in the conspiracy theory world there, is that you need to, you're using these time zones mainly to retain the time of day relative to the sun, etc. Right? So if the sun is technically traversing a certain amount of distance or whatever, while it takes 24 hours to go around, it's going to appear to traverse a certain area at a different speed, relative to the radius of that circumference and stuff. So that was kind of the theory that's kind of in the conspiracy area. You know how we can solve this? Just 24 time zones. Well, again, double it. 48. Like I said, I can accept 48. I'd want 24. But guys, fix the time zones. And you won't have all these extra conspiracy theories floating around. The conspiracy theories explain why there's so many weird time zones down in those island areas. About as good as the regular time zone theory of just random political lines and trade treaties and all that jazz. Because both of them are insane and crazy. And at least with the flat earth conspiracy one, they at least still cut up the globe somewhat. They kind of cut it up. Kind of weirdly, though, but I mean, it's based on our time zones. It's actually based on those time zones. It's not like they created new time zones and said, oh, this is what it would be like. No, those are the time zones that we have. They just figured out that you could fit them into this round Earth model because of the madness that is time zones. So again, just fix the time zone problem. Honestly, the amount of time wasted on time zones is insane. It's insane. And I'm sure there's just deaths every year because of time zones. I don't know what they are, but I'm sure there's tons of deaths every year. I'm sure of it. Anyways, that is it for the first episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. And like I said, this was just more of a general one. It wasn't really a rant as much as you'd think so. I tried to hold back on the ranting. Not really feeling angry at the moment about Timezones. Just wanted to kind of talk about them. A little bit of the insanity, some of the conspiracy theories that I've seen come up around them. But yeah, in the future, if I'm really, really getting, say, pissed off from Timezones again, maybe a problem comes up and I gotta suckle that cone one more time, then I will probably come back in anger before reaching enlightenment. You know, there's stages. It's kind of like stages of grief. Before you can reach enlightenment of Timezones, you must first reach a state of catharsis. And it is only from the state of catharsis that you can realize and feel the shame of your catharsis and move beyond that to a state of acceptance and enlightenment. But catharsis comes before acceptance, in my experience. So it is there that I will try to capture and refine the essence of that catharsis in the Red Rage segments. But until then, hold off expecting too much from this podcast until I can figure out exactly where it's going. But otherwise, if you have any feedback, I would appreciate it. If there's anything you want me to talk about, by all means, throw some suggestions my way. And yeah, if you're a hater, just fuck off. Anyways, thank you and take care.